Mode.
Hello everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, ZeroNet Energy in the School Community for Administrators and Stakeholders. My name is Connie Umfris. I'm the Communications Manager at New Buildings Institute. Before we begin, I have a couple housekeeping things to tell you about. First, you are muted and we cannot hear you. This helps keep the background noise down so that everyone can better hear our speakers. I want to direct you to the dashboard that you should be able to see on the right-hand side of your screen. If you are having technical difficulties and cannot see the slides or hear our speakers, you can use the question pane in this dashboard to let us know and we will help you as we go. We will take questions at a couple points in the session, but you can ask questions anytime during the webinar using the same question pane. Tomorrow you will receive a link to the slides and on-demand recording. You'll receive a second email with a link to a survey. We would appreciate your input on the content and delivery of this webinar to improve future sessions. Now I would like to introduce you to my colleagues, Heather Flint-Chatto and Ralph Denola. Heather Flint-Chatto is a project manager with New Buildings Institute. She is supporting NBI's work with the California Public Utility Commission Zero Net Energy Action Plan for Commercial Buildings and communication of measured performance finding from NBI research. She is experienced in architectural design, environmental policy, and long-range planning. New Buildings Institute's CEO, Ralph Denola, has dedicated his professional life to bringing sustainability, green building, and energy efficiency innovation to scale. For more than 20 years, he has served as a consultant to developers, governments, and Fortune 500 companies seeking quantum advances in their building practices and projects. He has been invited to provide keynote presentations at corporate meetings and international conferences and serves as an expert facilitator and educator. Take it away, Ralph.
Thanks so much, Connie. And thank you all for participating with us today. We're excited to host this webinar, and we have a lot of great content in store for you today. So we would like to get started. We want to go through our agenda quickly. We will start with these introductions, and then we'd like to gather actually some of your expectations for today. We are going to introduce you to the Proposition 39 ZNE School Retrofit Pilot Program that is being promoted by the utilities in California. We're going to give you a status update of the national status of ZeroNet Energy nationally and in California. We're going to provide some really excellent case studies that you can use as a guide for adopting your own ZeroNet Energy plan for your school or school district. And then we're going to have some time for questions and answers in the middle. And then we're going to move into really a step-by-step process of developing your ZNE plan, incorporating ZNE into your policies and delivery process, the resources for engaging and educating stakeholders, and then we'll have some discussion and wrap up. So we'd like to start, if you could use the question pane. We'd like to know, what questions do you have for us today? What information do you hope that we will share during the webinar? And we'd like to gather those so that we can actually help to customize some of the content as we go. So take a minute and enter some questions into the question pane, and then we will be reviewing those and responding to those as we go. Okay, so let's jump right in and talk about the California foundational policies that really have led to this program, the Proposition 39 ZNE School Retrofit Pilots, and the status of ZNE. So you should be aware that there is a investor-owned utility effort to pilot ZeroNet Energy School Retrofit in California. This really originated with the California Public Utilities Commission wanting to help to advance the market for ZeroNet Energy in the state of California and really help to move into deep energy retrofit of existing schools. So this is a program that is basically being rolled out by the 4 investor-owned utilities throughout the state. and they're developing a comprehensive plan. They're piloting, identifying pilot schools in 2 phases, and then the IOUs are consulting and coordinating with stakeholders, which is actually this is part of that. So as part of the program, NBI has been engaged to deliver workshops. So we're delivering 6 technical workshops, 6 institutional workshops, and then we're developing 5 Zero Net Energy School case studies, training materials, which we're seeing today, and presentations. And then importantly, we're going to be developing a Zero Net Energy Schools recognition program, which is a mechanism to recognize leadership in ZNE schools. The pilot started last year, and there was round 1 where schools applied to be pilot projects, and the applicants were reviewed and vetted, and then there was a set of schools selected. And then this year there's round 2, so there was an application process that closed last month, I think, right, Heather? And so in the end, what the utilities are working on is to get a total of 8 to 13 projects in round 2, and you can see this on the screen broken down by the utilities and also by whether these are K-12 or community colleges, because this program includes basically both the K-12 schools and community colleges.
We have a couple questions, actually. So I wonder, yeah, let me just jump in. So there were a couple questions about whether or not this Prop 39 project is process is a joint venture with the utilities or just something being supported by them. Mm-hmm.
Well, this is, so the utilities have come together instead of each of them developing their own unique Prop 39 Zero Net Energy School retrofit pilot program. This is something they are doing jointly. So the benefit of that is that there's continuity across the state, that there's uniformity, and that the professionals that are supporting this and also the schools that are engaged in this are getting a consistent message and set of tools and resources, and they're using the same methodology. So good question. Yes, it is a coordinated effort among these utilities.
Mm-hmm. And another question was whether there are going to be additional Prop 39 funds going to be made available to support ZNE projects. And there are going to be multiple rounds of these pilots happening it's a 5-year pilot. Mm-hmm. So we've just initiated round 2. Actually, it just ended, I think, maybe a week and a half ago. Mm-hmm. And so, those first set of pilots are in progress right now, and we'll have a lot to learn from those first ones, and encourage others to apply for future rounds of this. We had another, do you want to add anything? Okay, so we also had another question about whether or not there were going to be rebates available to assist with costs, or whether Prop 39 funds were the only source of funds.
Yeah, and so there are Proposition 39 funds that are available to schools to do energy efficiency retrofits. This program provides additional funding from the utilities to help reduce the costs of let's say the stretch from a retrofit to getting to zero. So there's definitely these additional funds if you are in the program, and so we definitely, as Heather was saying, we encourage you to look to the next round to apply and get involved.
And there are, savings by design resources.
That's right.
And other kind of financing support for special studies or consulting.
And we have slides to share that later. Yeah. So, any others that you want to highlight now, or do we move forward?
Well, I just wanted to mention a couple of the other questions we might be able to get to later. I think people were interested in comparative analysis of life cycle cost analysis of different HVAC systems. So people were curious about how we might adapt the California experience to other climate zones.
I see this question about zero net energy portables. So I was just at a Green Schools Conference in Maynard, Massachusetts, and CHIPS was talking about a partnership that they have with a modular construction and they're actually developing modular construction standards, and there is a manufacturer that they're working with to come up with a zero net energy modular classroom. Mm-hmm. So I think that's in the works, and I think that's a pretty exciting development.
And I think maybe just one more that someone asked was about how to apply to be a pilot for their district. And so we have a slide at the end, but really people can go to the energydesignresources.com website, and there's more information about the pilot process and the program and what the application is. So you can explore more about the detailed application efforts there.
Yeah. Great. So we always like to start with this slide to say, well, what is the definition of zero net energy? So a basic definition is that a zero net energy building is an ultra efficient building that generates as much energy as it consumes through the use of clean, renewable resources. This is also known as net zero energy or a zero energy building. So that's a very basic definition, and this is often a site-based metric. And so we like to use this as a simple and concise definition, and we'll get into the California Energy Commission definition in just a moment. But we also wanted to say, why are we doing these pilots, and how did all of this begin? And I think it really goes back to the big, bold goals for zero net energy in California. So this was basically in 2008 as part of the Energy Efficiency Strategic Plan, these big, bold goals to say all new commercial construction should be zero net energy by 2030, half of existing buildings retrofit to ZNE by 2030, and then all new residential construction in California to be ZNE by 2020. So those goals really, I think, set in motion all of these activities, the strategic plan for California energy efficiency, and then the action plans that include a commercial action plan and a residential action plan. Going back a little further, really I think the thing that generated all of this is the Global Warming Solutions Act, AB 32 in 2006. Which basically was really the state declaring that they would have greenhouse gas emissions targets, and also AB 758, which was really a focus on energy efficiency in existing buildings. And again, those led to the long-term energy efficiency strategic plan. So these are the kind of foundational policies that are really driving ZNE in the state of California, and led to this pilot program. Also, it's worth noting that there is the executive order B1812, basically requiring state buildings to reduce their energy use over the next 2 decades, again identifying that half of new facilities beginning design after 2020 be zero net energy, and 100% of state building major renovations beginning design after 2025 be ZNE as well. So this is again an executive order for state-owned facilities, and we know that state agencies are moving forward with this in earnest. I think probably one of the most kind of compelling slides to look at and graphic here, this chart, which basically shows how the state, through the California Energy Commission, plans to work on bringing the code to zero by 2020 for residential, 2030 for commercial. And you can see this is by steps in 3-year code cycles. And I think that this is not only impacting California, but it's also, I think, having a ripple effect across the country when national corporations and multinationals are looking at doing business in California. They recognize that this code is coming and that they need to be prepared to do this, to achieve zero net energy if they plan to do business in California and build buildings there. So how do you measure ZNE? Well, there's several ways to measure it. One is energy use intensity, which is thousands of BTUs per square foot per year, the EUI, and that is really a site-based metric that is a common metric that's being used among design teams and owners to compare their building to others. So we'll talk about some examples of that in just a moment. time-dependent valuation of energy is really a California metric that that is being used in the state of California, and it's the metric that the California Energy Commission uses for code compliance. So TDV, you'll hear the term TDV used quite often, and it's really trying to understand the total implications of energy use and the impact of energy use in the state, and really, what are the social benefits of the time of use of energy. So we can talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And then there's a ZNE code building, right? So we're looking at getting the code to zero, and a ZNE code building would also be using TDV, and we're going to see this coming, and it's already happening in the use of reach codes and the code cycles that we have coming up. So here's, I think, a fairly simple way to understand time-dependent value of energy, and again, that TDV metric, basically saying that we're not just thinking about energy, which is that light blue bar on the bottom, but we're also thinking about the cost or impacts of losses of energy, the ancillary services that utilities and energy provides, the capacity of the utility grid and the need for capacity when energy load comes on to the utility grid. There's transmission and distribution costs and the impacts associated with that. There's a retail rate adjustment that the utilities use to factor in the cost between the wholesale rate and the retail rate. And then basically the impacts of emissions from energy generation or electricity generation. So the price of electricity is really factoring in all of these things, and so this is why the California Energy Commission is using TDV instead of just electrons or electricity or kilowatt hours for buildings in California, and this is what's being used for the ZNE definition in California. So I'm going to hand it over to Heather really to give you a status update on ZNE and really to set the context for these zero net energy retrofit pilots.
Thanks, Rob. So NBI has been tracking zero net energy buildings for a good long time, and we probably have more information than any other organization out there. And so we're happy to be able to share a lot of that with you as resources, and we'll cover that a little bit more at the end of the webinar. So I hope you'll stay on. I know it's a little bit of a longer webinar, but really there's a lot of meat here that can help you in your process. So one of the great resources we have is our Getting to Zero Buildings database, and this is the largest database on ZNE buildings in North America, and it's a portal into the Department of Energy's High Performance Buildings database. So there's a lot of great detail. You can get summary information, but you can also get in-depth information on, when people have done case studies, they've entered this information, and you can get more detail about costs and finance and design strategies and things like that. So it's one of the only databases that's searchable by ZNE status and energy performance. So when you have a chance, please check that out. Much of our research has been based on our initial report that started in 2012, where we did a scan nationally and looked at all of the ZNE buildings we could find through case studies and design teams, and really tried to document all of the buildings across the country, both verified and emerging. And now we've documented 44 states and provinces with ZNE buildings. So NBI maintains a list of these buildings nationally. We also have one specific to California, which we'll talk about in a minute. But you can see that California is really leading the market. A third of the buildings that are ZNE verified or emerging are in California. So it's very exciting. And we'll be continuing to update this research annually. In 2012, we did our first study, and it had a very small set of verified buildings. That's that green bar. And also a similarly small set of emerging buildings. Really, this was very new. And then this orange bar is the ultra-low energy buildings, really on par with the energy performance of zero energy buildings, but maybe they don't have the renewables, or maybe didn't have a goal for getting to zero, but really have a lot to teach us about ultra-low energy performance and how these projects are getting there. And then in 2014, we updated our study, the Getting to Zero Status Update, website, and that's available on our website. Many of the charts and graphs that you see in this are in there. But you can see that that blue bar of emerging buildings has really leapt up. And then now in 2016, we've doubled what we found in 2014 in that emerging set. We still have a small set of verified buildings, but that doesn't mean that there aren't out there a good set of those. It's just that getting the data is a challenge, and so we encourage you to continue to share your data with us.
These are the ones we're aware of.
Yes, exactly. So please tell us more if you have a verified building or you think that your building is performing at zero. So some of the things that we've learned is that, really we've moved beyond kind of those, small one-off low occupancy buildings like environmental centers, which typically are the first to demonstrate these, innovative sustainability measures. And we're moving into many different building types across the United States, small to medium commercial offices, government, public sector buildings, K-12 schools and higher education institutions, but also large office facilities like the NREL building in Colorado, which is in the upper right-hand corner. So really we're seeing that this is possible in many types across the United States and also in many climates. A good set of this was really started in the public sector, but is consistently moving into the private sector as well as nonprofits, really walking the talk with their mission. So buildings like the Packard Foundation, the Hilton Foundation, other kinds of Bullitt Center buildings, really starting to demonstrate leadership through their buildings. We're also seeing that this is happening not only in new construction projects, but very possible in renovation. So a quarter of the market is in renovations. A broad diversity of building types, as I mentioned, but also the education sector is really leading, both from K through 12, higher education, and general assembly, so like libraries, such as the California building, the Berkeley West Branch Library was also just, and it's actually a net positive building and just verified as LEED Platinum and certified by the International Living Future Institute. So we have a lot to learn from this education sector, really moving into this market. So when we looked at all of the buildings with measured performance data, we saw kind of a consistent bar compared to what our national commercial building energy consumption survey average was for these buildings. So we wanted to highlight that really this was in a spectrum of 0 to 40 of an energy use intensity, and that where we found the average was around 21, and that's a good benchmark to know, because we've heard from other designers that really if you aim for around 20 for an EUI and your building is maybe 2 stories, you can probably get enough photovoltaics on there to get to 0. And that there's a similar range there when we looked at all the education buildings that were verified, that around 24.5 was the average. So we're seeing buildings getting even lower and lower EUIs than that as we have more and more data. A particularly great example of this is the Richardsville Elementary School in Kentucky, and this was one of a set of 6 schools that CMTA design firm was hired to develop, and as each school was designed and built, they learned from the last project and were able to incorporate more and more energy efficiency measures to get to 0. So through these projects, we're seeing there are very common efficiency measures, similar to what we found across the board, common technologies getting to ultra-low energy, high efficient envelope, building orientation and glazing that had a really strong focus on daylighting and controls, using energy management systems and dashboards, and a focus on plug load reductions particularly is a really important one to be thinking about as we start to really get our buildings much tighter in our envelopes and really work with our lighting and our HVAC systems. Plug loads become a much larger piece of the pie that we have to address. So some of the challenges that we had when looking at where ZNE is moving and what the perception in the market is really a challenge, particularly around the perception of cost, not necessarily cost, but perception of cost. And we're finding that we're able to get there within the range, reasonable range of construction costs, but helping overcome that perception is important. Often photovoltaics are delayed due to cost, and then getting the metering and the data, getting the metering right and using the data that you have correctly is also sometimes a challenge, making sure that people are trained appropriately to use that data effectively to be able to adjust and course correct where needed. Often the projects are not occupied or operated as modeled, and so that's another thing to really be attentive to. You know, are you having a higher number of students in a building, or are you maybe not operating as the schedule was originally designed and worked with the design team on? Commissioning is becoming an increasingly important part of the design process, and making sure that you have maybe a longer time frame in your contract, that it might take 2 years instead of 1 year to really tune up the building appropriately. And then last but certainly not least is the sphere of disclosure. So we can tell you about the buildings we know about, but there are many more buildings out there that are very excellent examples, and I think there's a perception that if you're not at zero, you know, that there's something to be a little bit embarrassed about because you haven't quite achieved that goal, but really,
failing grade.
Right. So we really want to emphasize, you know, not to be afraid to share. There's so much we can learn from each of these projects, and that can inform other new emerging projects. And so we want people to be able to share their data. Maybe you're not quite at zero, but it's still a really great building and something to be proud of. So we really hope people will continue to share their data with us. One of the great resources that has emerged over the last year in support of the California Public Utilities Commission that NBI produces is the California ZNE watch list. And this is a great list of all the verified and emerging buildings in California. So last time we did the list, I think it was around 70 projects, and we'll be putting out a new one in the next couple of weeks, even higher numbers. So this is a nice way to look at other projects that are out there that might be similar to yours, learn about the design teams that maybe you might want to approach for a project you're doing, look at how these buildings have performed. So this is a great resource for you to kind of track and get on our notice list when these come out. And also wanted to mention just sort of where we are nationally on the school side. Really, we are at a very early side for schools, and but yeah, California is continuing to lead much farther out in advance. And there will be many more added to this set, particularly with the pilots coming forward and more schools that people just keep telling us about all the time. So one thing we wanted to, I think we're pretty close to on time. That's great. So we wanted to jump into talking about how you can learn from these projects using case studies as your guide. So we'll talk a little bit about some ZNE and ultra-low energy case studies really roughly or briefly, and then we'll have Pauline Souza from WRNS Studio join us to talk about one of the first verified ZNE school projects in California. So as part of the Prop 39 work, NBI is developing 5 new case studies. And this really documents some of the design strategies, but also some of the planning and lessons learned of these projects. And, you know, really this pilot is about zero net energy school retrofits, both K through 12 and community colleges. But really there aren't any ZNE school retrofit examples yet. So we really scanned the market and what were the projects, both big and small, that we could learn from that had different strategies that we thought were most valuable. So these are the set that we have developed some draft case studies, and we'll be coming forward with those in the next few months to be able to share with you. For the Berkeley West Branch Library, even though that is not a school building, it is a very typical building type for schools. And you know, Pauline will talk about the Stevens Library at Sacred Heart Elementary School, and so that's a good example that many schools can be thinking about for their libraries. The Georgina Black Middle School, which is our retrofit example, and that was done, I think it was maybe 2003, but is a really great example of an ultra-low energy retrofit. The George Leva Middle School, which is emerging ZNE and is probably at ZNE right now. We're just having, you know, as we mentioned, getting the data is tricky. So we hope that one will soon move to the verified list. And the City College of San Francisco multi-use building is a really nice large building of more than 100,000 square feet. And the Jeffrey Trail Middle School, both and the Irvine Unified School District have a lot to teach us. So I'll talk about a couple of those. So I mentioned the City College building of San Francisco, which is a really great project and really used a lot of natural ventilation strategies. It's one of the largest modern buildings fully reliant on natural ventilation. And it was able to use ground source central plant to serve other buildings in the area and really provide a great sustainable design project. The Jeffrey Trail Middle School and the Irvine Unified School District was an interesting example because they also were looking more broadly at their whole portfolio of buildings. So they initially were looking to bond for solar on one particular school, and they realized it was going to be much more effective for them to use a power purchase agreement to fund a solar portfolio. So they basically have been putting solar panels on all of their campuses. So it's a really nice strategy to be thinking about, maybe using a power purchase agreement, but also want to make sure that people remember to maintain their renewable energy credits. It's a key strategy there. They also had a very effective energy management protocol, so making sure that they had a way to engage the occupants, and you'll hear that kind of over and over as we talk through our design and planning and operations emphasis on operations and tenant behavior. So really making sure that the facilities managers are engaged in this, but also that the teachers and other occupants are making sure that they're effectively engaging with the buildings to keep them operating at that low energy performance. And so that's something that we're putting together a set of templates, and so we can share that with you as well. Also, letting these buildings be kind of living learning classrooms is a great strategy. So using the science, technology, engineering, arts, and math, sort of STEM and STEAM programs is a really great way to think about how you can be using your curriculum to engage with renewable energy and thinking about conservation and how the students are actually having an impact in the functioning and energy savings of your buildings. In addition, we have the Georgina Black School I mentioned. Lisa Gelfin from Gelfin Partners has been one of our presenters several times, so we are grateful that, this school is a good example of how a retrofit project can really get to a high energy efficiency. I think it has an EUI of 33, which for that time was very, very low. And it was a collaborative project for the high performance, it's a collaborative high performance schools project, one of the first CHIPS projects, and had savings by design incentives to help fund many of the special studies of the project. But it also was working with a very good orientation, so that was effective. And really there's a lot to learn from this particular project too. So very high energy savings beyond Title 24, and you know, lots of daylighting, and became a model school for the district that then has inspired the district to look across their portfolio of buildings and do some special studies to find out how much further they would need to go if they wanted to achieve net zero energy or net zero water too. So there are some more California examples that I wanted to just mention. We'll hear about the Stevens Library as well in a moment, but also the Reading School for the Arts is an emerging ZNE project, and we have a case study, an NBI, that's on our website that was one of 8 that we've done for the California Public Utilities Commission, and these are nice short case study briefs, 2 pages, that make a good example if you want to be bringing this to your superintendent or your school board, if you want to be educating and advocating for this. And this is an emerging ZNE building. I think it has an EUI of 8. And what they've done as an interesting strategy is continually add photovoltaics to get to that low level. So even if you can't put it on all at one time, you can be continuing to add it. We're going to be actually doing a tour on May 9th of the Solano School, which is an emerging ZNE project in Southern California. And that was designed for ZNE, and they're continuing to, you know, they'll be adding their photovoltaics over time. The Blackford School is one of 8 ZNE projects that the Campbell School District has decided to pursue, and I think 2 of those 8 have been built, and they are using kind of a prototype approach, so there's some interesting lessons to learn there, and La Escuelita in Oakland is another good example. So I wanted to kind of introduce our next speaker. I'm hoping that she is, do we have her on? All right, okay, good. So Pauline Souza is an architect and LEED accredited professional with 25 years of experience focused on design and management of facilities for education. She's an associate partner and director of green services at WRNS Studio and is responsible for implementing sustainable design principles into all their studio projects and business operations. She's currently serving as the Green Schools Advocate for the USGBC NCC, working to bring the message about greening schools to the K through 12 and higher education market. So, Pauline.
Yes.
Oh, good. All right, I'm going to turn it over to you. And do you want me to advance the slides? All right. Okay.
Probably.
So, welcome.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Heather. So I thought we'd walk through, as Heather mentioned, a bit of our case study, and if you can go to the next slide, because it illustrates some of the things that we went through, which were really well presented by the NBI team already, and it just might help reemphasize a process and a pathway that we think can work for projects regardless of size, and I would say, and hopefully illustrating to you all that it can be done within the budget that you have. So this case study is in California in Climate Zone 3, and there's some stats up on the screen. The full project is part of a bigger campus, and our little area is about 10 acres and 85,000 square feet of building for 450 students. But the key fact here is that we were asked during this time to build at a cost that was about 20% less than the conventional cost per square foot at that time. And this was 2009, 2010, so the economy wasn't doing so great, but we normalized that and took that into the account. So if you can do the next slide. We had a great client and an amazing team and a pretty cool programming, a pretty good program. Next. And the point of that is that while this client wasn't looking for net zero, honestly, they were not coming to us with huge environmental benchmark targets, whether it be LEED or living building. They did want to educate their students to become exceptional leaders, and there was a responsibility that they recognized in terms of environmental stewardship. So next slide. And this is just to say that it really took a village. It took this whole team, the client at the top in the middle. Sandy was instrumental in supporting us as we investigated this, but Interface and Integral and Sherwood engineers and Salter were all key in helping us find that balance and right-sizing things to get to this, to where we have been lucky to be a part of this net zero family. So next slide. So the green at the bottom is really just to say to you all that this was an evolving desire, so if you don't start off that way, there's a way we believe that you can get there towards this sustainable agenda, and then again, to do this within budget. Next. And for this campus, it was really designed, it needed to be designed within the trees, the heritage trees that existed on the campus, and the fact that this city did not have a stormwater system for any of its residences. And that's important, and I'll get to that later because it really did impact the energy budget. Next slide. And a view just of the trees that we worked around, and the next slide. And what a lot of you all know, which is before you start, you gather what you have, both in terms of what's the forecast, what are the temperatures, what's the wind, where is it all coming from, and then next. And you start to try to make sure you're designing with all those considerations. And we often use not just the benchmark systems like LEED or living building, but also the ideas brought to us through the AIA COAT measures, and really about flexibility and long life and feedback loops. So the next slide. The key again is that this project, although it's in an area of an affluent area, did not trickle down to this particular project. So it was about $250 to $300 a square foot. That was what we were asked to design to. And again, that in that area and at that time was 20% less normalized across the project for this building that we're going to talk about next. and then again the campus. And the next slide to show you the 4 buildings. And our targets, or what we understood at the time that CVEX provided us, and then this evolved approach that we were looking at various benchmark systems. We engaged in a net zero pilot project with PG&E and their consultant Cadmus, and then with others, Peter Turnbull and Dean, in trying to tell this story. And the next slide. Our project was also, because it was a campus, we looked at what we could do to make efficient buildings, and how could those flat roofs not only be used to collect water for water reuse, but those roofs are all designed for and are PV ready. So there's space that is allocated and was noted in the construction documents for future inverters. There's pathways up to the roof. The structure was, again, designed to make sure that that could be done later. So this is about maybe future proofing or making it future ready for net zero if it couldn't be done right away. And as this evolved through DD, we talked about that as a strategy, even though it wasn't clear that the money could be there for PVs. So next slide. So that's the building up at the top that I'm going to talk about. Against the CVEX standard, we thought we could get to a 27 EUI. In the next slide. And that's the south elevation over there in the back. In the next slide. The west elevation. And so as you can see, as we went through this process, and I'll speak a little bit about that evolution, we were able to work PVs into the building by showing them that the buildings were tuned to be as efficient as possible, and that we could get enough PVs on the project to really get it to net zero and net positive. And that inspired them to find the money somewhere within the buildings. We had to work with our estimator and really with the builder. But the fact that the story kind of evolved with the design, and we were able to show it was possible, got them so excited that they started to move towards approving for the LEED final submission to look at the Living Building Challenge net zero participation, and then we're continuing to look at it from a pedal recognition. So the next slide. Just a little bit on the stats. The system is mixed mode, using the concepts of displacement ventilation. We have air that comes over the top of the main book space, flows down, and then sort of puddles, as many of you know, and then is exhausted through another, and I'll show you where that is in the exhaust point. But that strategy was very efficient. So larger ducts, having windows at 2 ends to allow for fresh air, so it could help augment that main space. Next slide. And then solar tubes, oh sorry, and so just dashed lines to show where the displacement was coming through, both in the sort of top and bottom orange dashed lines, and then to the left, that's where the exhaust would be. And then, thank you, next. Showing how simple daylighting strategies at the top for solar tubes that are could be manipulated and tuned down. Good light from the north and south. We really tried to tune that exterior as we were doing some work to see how light would penetrate. We've learned a little bit of lesson in terms of daylighting, that you need to use a few better tools, because we thought we cut out a lot of glare, but there's still a little that trickles in between 12 and 11. Sorry, 11 and 12. But just the idea to tune it to daylighting. And then the roof is shown that we were able to fit 170 panels, at that time 250 watts per panel, size to be 40 kW over the target, which at that time 15% seemed to be the right strategy. We had flat panels We had to change from tilted to flat panels, which is a little less efficient, about 13%, because the city didn't want to see anything over a certain height limitation. So there was that that we had to work through. And then the next slide, just showing performance, which we were able to track. Again, like I said, we had PG&E that was a part of was our partner through the end of the phases. They came in with their own metering, and we were able to compare what we were seeing and what they were seeing to show that we were overall producing more than we were using. Next. And then to show that in the graphs that we would collect through its use, the prediction of 50,000 kWh, and then having us measure, as we were measuring, we were really seeing that it produced more at 56,000 approximately kWh. And the next. So that was a good sign. And then we started to understand what some of the challenges were in comparing our modeling data, or at least what we predicted, to how it was being used. And I think this is our big next step. The hot water heater was not being used as it was modeled. You can see quite a big difference. And then the lighting too, as was modeled, is not how it was being tracked. And I think we attribute that to the modeling software not being able to be tuned to the things I talked about, the contribution of natural daylight, and probably we think because as people are more tuned into this building being an example of sustainable strategies, they know that they don't want the lights on. So there's a little people side of it that we were hoping to track more of. Mechanical seems really pretty close to what was predicted. January and February were days where the systems weren't working well, and so that's aligned with what we were finding out here, and the miscellaneous, as we talked about, sort of all the other plug load and how we had modeled it, but really, again, maybe the people side brings the measured part down. Next slide. So the highs and the lows, which really can be attributed to better tracking and constant communication. Next slide. And the envelope. So in the envelope, we really, again, were of the mind that we had to reduce where we could. So you reduce before you produce, right? So the envelope was really studied. We thought we were getting to pretty good R values. As we were going through construction documents, the owners found out from their insurance company that if they had a metal stud building, they could reduce their insurance burden by enough that it made sense to change it out. But it changed our energy model data, and so if we had stuck to what we had with the wood, we could have really made a difference in terms of what that envelope was coming out to be. I think we would have been an R20 versus the R12. So that's kind of a lesson that we learned, and speaks a lot to looking at your envelope as you design more and more. What we didn't also do was put insulation below the slab, which is something that I think we missed, and we're trying to be more careful of. Next slide. And so a picture just again of how that change in assembly from wood to metal had to be tracked, and you could easily in the throes of CDs forget that you need to track that, and how that needs to then be accommodated in your energy budget. Next slide. So lighting, we talked a little bit about the daylighting model, how that would have made the quality of the comfort of that space better, but also how artificial lighting needs to be tracked. And the next slide shows in the pie charts quite a bit of change. So the top pie chart shows where we were at 37% predicted, but then as we were tracking through it, it's 4%. And that's a huge difference in kWh, about 8,000 kWh, and that's a pretty big difference in terms of what we would have put in for PVs. Next slide. And really said a lot about how we looked at lighting and the controls, and maybe even what was it, how we explained the building that changed the behavior side. So the next slide really says it's the people side of it that we have to be more aware of and what their understanding is of comfort. And the next slide. And if we know that the contribution of daylight is critical not just to the quality of that space, but also to the predicted energy model, what are the programs out there? What can we do to drive that into either some sort of exceptional calculation or to right-size the model, if you will? So the next slide. So it goes a little bit more again on modeling site and the plug loads. Next slide. What we learned on a campus project is that everything is a little bit bigger than your footprint, and so the gray water system and all the pumps that make that work out through the filtration and then through the irrigation was burdened to the library. So all of that that you see on the screen to make that work was tied to the electrical panel in the library just because it was the closest, and we didn't account for that in the model. Next slide, and just again a diagram to show that. Next slide. And so just to say, if you're working just on a project that has a little bigger footprint, to watch out and to really have your model be a part of your conversation and not a part of a deliverable that then gets nicely filed, to really use that as you go through as a communication tool. Next slide. Just some images of how close those components were and how they were tied again to the building. Next slide. Just a picture with kids so people feel happy on the call. Next slide. So the next slide would show, hopefully, again, how that what the PG&E folks were tracking to was that that gray water system really accounted for 3,000 kWh. That was not predicted originally in the model, but as we were metering, we could accommodate, well, we had to include that into our actual calculations. And so this building with that is an EUI of 16.1. If we excluded that, because that system is a part of the whole campus, we could say that the building itself is at 13.2. But to be fair to what it actually is seeing, that campus gray water system is burdened again to the building. So just to again reiterate, watch your model, continue the conversation, because those things happen sometimes. You know, while you're in design and you think you've already got all your data noted and your targets, but things change. Keep next slide. So the next slide should show a little bit more about this point about how much PVs do you need for your building. And as we know, the prediction at 50,000 kWh approximately, and the measured at a good 56,000, so it was producing more than we thought. But the demand, based on all the things that that were shown, is really much less than what we thought. And so that's great news, but also, you know, tells us in the next slide, did we put in too much PVs? Even though we accommodated that 15%, which everyone knew would give us a little bit of cushion, you should see in the next slide that if we take all of those things into account, the lighting and the gray water, with that 8,000 kW difference, did we put too much PV on the project? And that's always an issue of budget, especially when budget is such a big part of the conversation, which I can't imagine there's a project where it isn't. Is it too much? Now on this campus, as mentioned, the idea is for all those rooftops to have PVs, and so it can be attributed to the overall campus goal. But when you're in a more urban setting, you know, is it too much and is it too good? So what's that sweet spot, and how do we plan or talk to our clients about planning for PVs so that maybe the end goal is an evolution of getting to net zero, and that how do we do that after we can actually measure how people use a building. Next slide. So again, just a few more slides to show how we were tracking the different uses through the year. The next slide. And how that information told us too that BMS controls is another thing that we need to look at, and that language really, if you see in the next slide, is something that we all as designers and engineers need to know and understand a bit more about, because we were finding out that in the next slide you'll see that the inverters and the controls were not talking to each other. We couldn't track what was going on. In fact, there was some failure that if we hadn't been trying to find that information towards a net zero certification, or just to see how well we were doing, we wouldn't have known that there were problems. And at that time too, the inverter company, Setcon, was going out of business, and so we were having a hard time. But again, next slide, it says there's more for us to do to understand how these things are linked together. And then the next slide, to be able to track in other ways, this is a snapshot of the inverter, to make sure we know that everything is talking to each other and working together for the actual tracking. And we did this as part of our submission to ILFI for net zero certification. Next slide. So as I think was said by the MBI team, you know, use your basis of design as your roadmap, and use that as a part of the communication tool, not just with the owner, but with each other. And then maybe to remember that some of the good things that come out of this, the highs, if you will, result in showing to what we think to the wider community that getting to net zero is something that can happen, even if it's not a part of your very first target, that it can evolve to that if you work together. And then the next slide show that there's some good things that happen with it. This is just the presentation of the net zero plaque from ILFI and our client there in the purple sweater. And our toughest audience is the students of that school, because they asked a lot of questions that our engineers had to think about how to answer. And then the next slides, really having them participate in understanding how things work, and how it ties together with their campus is a part of bringing that, we hope, to more projects. And the next slide showed just that it's not just about dollars saved, but it's about environmental stewardship. And the next slide shows it's about this education being very visible, and you can see that from the other buildings that are two-story, and so it's a part of their everyday world, and they can talk to it. They actually go home and tell their parents, and we hope that sort of grows more acceptance that this is not as difficult as many think. And if you continue through a couple of the next slides, we just thought we'd build some graphics into the building itself and into boards, which then we've used to show them in some events in the next slides. It's kind of tying how many PV panels do you need to power an iPhone, making it relevant, and then the educators have used that to continue bringing that forward in their curriculum. And so that little dashed area there is where there is a dynamic monitor tied to a Lucid system that's tied to the VMS, and they use that to go see what's happening that year. We actually have used. I've gone there a couple times and pressed the button. You can see in the next slide. It tracks how much is being produced. And a couple times it hasn't shown anything, and we'll go, oh my gosh, what's going on there? So I think it's a really quick way for anybody to understand either how things are working and what's being produced, but also how well the systems are working and communicating to each other. And the next slide shows a couple more. Again, on what's happening, there's a comparison. They compare each building. So this, I'll just end with this. This, I think, those two little boys that were coming to the school to go over some new things, and they were really excited about playing with the screen, which is fun. And then they ran around that corner up on the just to the left of them, and then then they ran back, and I realized what was happening is that they were flushing the toilets and then going back to the screen and seeing how much water, how that graph was moving. And they did that a couple times. I'm sure that wasn't the first time. And so it wasn't the intent of that system, but it meant that they were actually using it. They were making a connection. And I think for us, if you go to the very end, that system results in this that they put up. And all those lessons learned that I talked about, are things that we have to work on. But I think changing minds is part of what this is all about too. So I hope that for us, these lessons learned are great to share, and we'll take them to our next project, and hopefully we'll learn from many of you too.
Thank you so much, Pauline. Such a great project, and we appreciate you sharing this with us. And I hope you can stay on for just a couple more minutes for a few questions.
Yeah, so Connie is going to read some of the questions that have come in on that question pane, and then I guess the three of us could respond to those.
Okay, and I just wanted to remind everybody that you will be getting a link to both watch the on-demand recording of today's session as well as getting the slides. We've had a couple comments about going a little slower, but you will have all of those materials to review at a later time. So our first question is it fair to say that areas with lower solar irradiance would need to drive to a lower EUI starting point?
So maybe I'll start, and I don't know if Pauline, you've had this experience with other projects. Yes, the solar radiation or the amount of renewables that you might be able to put on your site do impact how you do the calculation for how much renewables you need. I don't think you necessarily have to target a lower EUI. I think there's this question about the balance between driving, energy efficiency versus adding renewables. And so, we do have a technical training that we're doing throughout the state where we address that, I think, more specifically. And I think as we get into actually the remainder of the presentation, I think we can address that as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. In our experience on projects, we're doing some where in Hawaii where it's a little different. And what we've done, we're lucky to work with a couple folks where that is taken into consideration. But I agree with Ralph that it doesn't seem to be the biggest challenge to getting there. Yeah.
Okay, the next question regarding commissioning. Are the energy-using systems, HVAC and controls, more complex? What about training?
Do you want to start, Ralph, and I'll also follow?
Sure. I think what we would suggest is that there are ZNE buildings that have very complex systems, and there are those that have simpler, more manual control. And so I don't think that you necessarily always get a more complex building with a ZNE building. And I think it's really important that that's one of those questions you try and address up front at the beginning of a project to say, how complex is this building going to be? How will our facility staff and occupants manage that? And Pauline, I imagine this was part of the conversation about the library.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to know that there's a difference between complex and different. So I think that often we run into the facility side where we're just proposing something different. And it's not complicated, it's just a mixed mode or it's a different vendor. And so we walked through the system and we've walked through what we imagine would be how they would operate it. And so I think that none of the systems I've seen tied to net zero are complicated. They just require a little bit more care. And part of that is that I think, in previous days, we just set things on the roof and plugged them in, and we all thought they were working. When really, if we tracked them, they probably weren't working.
Right.
And so there's a little difference of sort of mind shift, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think that implied in the question is, yes, there is a need for occupant and operator training and engagement, and actually doing that not just once, but on an ongoing basis. There's turnover of students, there's turnover of faculty, there's turnover of facility staff. So it's important that you have an integrated education program for those folks.
Yeah, good point. I forgot to mention too that we did do the sort of usual, here's how it works, and then we've gone back a couple times with different users, including the teachers, the educators and staff and students, and said this is how it works. So there's a little bit of continued or a reminder system that has to be in place.
And that might be interesting to also be thinking about in terms of your architecture contract too for the design team, and making sure that not just the commissioners being on a longer term contract, but maybe the design team as well.
Yeah. So I think, Connie, we have time for one more question.
Okay. Was it determined why the modeling was so far off in predicting the hot water and lighting energy usage?
Sure. I think we were using eQuest, and it just didn't have, I'm going to say this incorrectly for all you who do modeling well out there, that there wasn't enough ability to fine-tune it for the use and contribution. So the team has since moved to some different modeling software that can accommodate that. I know before we would start to develop exceptional calculations or something that would prove it, and it just, I think now with the different software, there's an ability to have that fine-tuning. So.
Yeah, and I think probably what you're referencing is that there's often default values that you either have to stick with or you have to do exceptional calculations, and you've probably transitioned to Energy Plus from eQuest, and so that ability to fine-tune it, I think we're getting much more sophisticated with modeling capability, and I think we would certainly encourage using the most current software for setting those values. So thank you so much, Pauline. What a fantastic case study, and I think really supportive of this program and giving people a real-life example, and especially those lessons learned. I think that's really what people are hungry to hear. We know there are other questions. We'll try and address those later. Pauline, if you can stay on, that's great. Otherwise, maybe we'll allow you to get back to your great work, and thank you again.
Thanks for including me. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay. So let's continue. So now that we've got the background, the context of the status of zero net energy nationally and in California, and the policies that have driven that, and some really good case studies, we can talk about how you do this, right? How do you develop your ZNE plan? So, and what are the resources and tools that are available to you? So the work that NBI has been doing in the state of California, both for the California Public Utilities Commission and the Investor-Owned Utilities, and some of our work actually funded through foundation support, has led to the development of tools and resources for ZNE and developing your ZNE plan. What you see on the screen is a tool set that we have available today we are planning this year to update it into a more comprehensive set of guidance and templates. So for instance, we have a template that's shown here that helps you really to think about diagrammatically how to set your goals and your target, create a vision, and then really understand who are the key stakeholders that need to be involved in that process, and what are the activities that you might do. So for instance, as I think Pauline was sharing, at the beginning you may get everyone together for a ZNE workshop or charrette, and at that session, make sure that you have the right stakeholders that are representing the design team and the administration, maybe faculty and students as well, school board members, understanding who those stakeholders are and making sure they're at the table, who's responsible for the bond program or for financing this project. They need to be there. And in that, you can set that vision. What are you trying to accomplish? And then the goals, how do we measure our success to achieving that vision? And then some specific targets, and we'll talk about the ZNE target in just a moment. And so as you do that, you go through this process, you say, well, maybe we need to set some policies that we need the school board to adopt, and who are the relevant stakeholders for the policy making, and what are those activities. And then looking at the district or the portfolio of buildings, either on a campus or throughout the district, and then getting down to individual projects. So the idea of this template is just to give you a framework through which you can work on developing your ZNE plan. And then there are other worksheets that help you. Basically, these are exercises in the workshop. We often use these to actually have people take a chance to think about articulating a vision and really describing or defining success, and then identifying targets and milestones. So again, supportive tools that you can use to start your ZNE plan process. We also are very supportive of this concept of backcasting. So rather than trying to forecast your way to zero, setting that target for achieving zero net energy on a building or on a campus or throughout a district. Perhaps you have the same goal as the state of California, getting there by 2030. And so we've got this template as a backcasting tool for the building scale and for portfolio scale, and it gives you the opportunity to think about a building in a much more planful way, I think. So let's just talk about some fundamentals that we've learned through this process. Assembling your building blocks of your ZNE plan. One, you want to set your goals and milestones, and we have a worksheet for that. You do the backcasting exercise to say, if that's our end goal, what are the steps along the way that we need to take to achieve that success? Identifying those key stakeholders and the communications goals. So we actually have, again, worksheets for stakeholder mapping. Who are your relevant stakeholders? And for all those kind of key elements of developing the plan and the policies and communicating. Developing actually a communication and outreach plan, because if you're really going to move forward with this, and if you're looking at trying to take it to scale, you may want to have a good outreach plan. You may be working on a bond issue, and you want to make this a part of that.
And we actually have a nice template that goes with the communications outreach plan that's almost done for you for both your internal and your external stakeholders. And it really talks about who are the people that you should be engaging in what type of activities and with what frequency. And so if you're going to be making, an annual update to your school board, or if you're engaging a green team on a quarterly basis, or things like that. So really can give you some of the activities that you want to be doing kind of already mapped out for you. So it's a great resource.
Yeah, and many of these templates have both a blank and one that is completed, so that it saves you time and effort, or at least you get to see rather than being a blank slate. And part of that also is doing a gap analysis, right? So what policies do we have? What plans do we have? Or do we have capital improvement projects in process? What do we need to do to get there in terms of ZNE planning?
Are there some special studies that need to be done, some feasibility analysis? How would you prioritize which project you might do?
Right.
That's been an interesting one that we've identified too. Is is there going to be some perception issues if you prioritized one over another?
Right, and with Prop 39, some of the selection process included questions like, if we evaluate all of these schools, which ones are actually performing really well, so that it's easier to get to zero compared to the ones that are not performing well. And that's a choice you're going to need to make when you evaluate your project. So again, this idea that Heather was just mentioning, are there studies that you need to conduct? We know, for instance, in a retrofit situation, one of the greatest risks you may be seeing is that there's a lot of unknowns with existing buildings, right? So you might want to do destructive analysis. You might want to do some as-built drawings to say, here's how the building is today, and really getting all of that, let's say trying to figure out all of those unknowns as much as possible to help reduce risk and cost and change orders later. Selecting a pilot, we were just talking about that, which one is going to be the best, and maybe a quick early win is actually the best strategy, so think about that. Think about the delivery methods. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but there's, again, a worksheet for that. And then thinking about how are we going to finance this. Is it through a current bond that you have, putting together those financing options? Importantly, making sure that your ZNE goal and target and your expected performance of the facility are in your RFQ and RFP and your contract documents. So that's really pretty essential. We'll cover that in just a moment. And then, of course, we need to really conduct a very thorough integrated design process and use proven technologies and strategies. And these, as we were sharing earlier, many of these are really what you might call state-of-the-shelf, right? These are not bleeding-edge technologies. These are time-tested, proven technologies and strategies. Those are the best ones to be thinking about. So let's move into the next phase, establishing your target. Right, so I think one thing that we like to suggest is that there is an energy loading order, and that this still is, I think, an essential part of getting to zero with your facility, and that is that you, as you might remember from your childhood, you have to eat your conservation vegetables before you can have your cake, right? So efficiency first before renewables is the loading order. And we still know and believe that efficiency is still the lowest cost, best return on investment that you can make. And by getting your building to be a low energy building first before renewables is actually not only good, for your overall project, but it's also good in terms of what California is trying to achieve with the building industry reducing total carbon emissions and also being a grid-friendly building. So the way we think about this is, if you're really focused on just adding renewables to an existing building without tackling efficiency first, you're not necessarily being a grid-friendly building. In other words, a building that is going to be not using energy when the utility grid is really taxed as much. You're going to have a total of a higher total gross energy use. You're going to need actually a lot more renewable energy generation. And you're probably going to be focusing on more kind of active strategies of mechanical systems, thermal storage, and other active systems. We favor efficiency-oriented buildings, right? So they're much more grid integrated and responsive. Which actually has financial benefits if you're not using energy during peak demand times. Lower gross energy use, right? Again, lowering your total use of energy from the grid. Lower renewable generation, so that's a lower capital cost. And then really implementing as many passive strategies as you can, which again are low cost and really often have little or no moving parts, so lower maintenance. So we really like this way of thinking about it. This is actually a diagram from Miller-Hull Partnership for the Bullitt Center in Seattle, a 6-story commercial office building on a zero lot line with that has achieved zero net energy. So thinking about the starting point on the left, a typical office building in Seattle uses 72,000 BTUs per square foot per year. So the design team said, how are we going to go about reducing total energy use in this building? They started with heating and cooling and saw that they could reduce pretty significantly the energy use in the building, right? So really high performance envelope, doing heat recovery, ground source heat pump, demand controlled ventilation, and radiant heating and cooling. And then moving into lighting, right, maximizing daylighting, really reducing lighting power density, and then ultimately trying to control plug loads and tenant loads and those unregulated loads. Got them down to an energy use intensity of 16, right? So you see that the total renewable energy system could be much smaller, and that also means that it's a lower cost for that system. And I would just add that the other key consideration, if you're considering power purchase agreements, you are still going to be purchasing energy from those renewables, right, from that third party. So isn't it better to be purchasing less energy overall? And so that also has a benefit. And I would also just note that one of the lessons learned from the Bullitt Center was that they were actually able to reduce energy use even further. So that building, as I've last heard, was using an energy use intensity of 10, right? So much lower than the modeled anticipated load. So it goes to show you can dramatically reduce energy use and then add renewables to get to zero. So just thinking about establishing your own target, how do you get to that target? Well, you want to define energy efficiency measures that are cost effective. So that can be done through doing an audit of your facility and or energy modeling. Define your operating schedule. As Heather was saying, your schedule could vary. So you want to make sure that you've got an accurate schedule of operations, and then compare that to your renewable energy generation and timing of that. Develop an iterative energy model that includes time-dependent value, again, for both code compliance and also just demonstrating achievement of the California metric. And then really understand how feasible is photovoltaics with your existing building, right? This is, again, a retrofit program. Can your roof actually hold the renewable energy systems, or do they have to be site-mounted? And then where will you put those renewable energy systems? What are the fire code issues related to using photovoltaics? And so you have to think about all of those things, and then from that you can determine your solar budget once you know how much energy you're going to be using. Here's just a list of some good energy efficiency measures. These are kind of advanced measures that you could be thinking about. What's really essential is to work with your design team, the architects, the engineers, to really come up with brainstorm a long list of energy efficiency measures and then prioritize those and test them through energy modeling. And it's also, important not just to focus on energy, but think about how this fits in with other standards, other green building standards, for instance, the Collaborative for High Performance Schools criteria, or LEED for schools, and think about energy as one factor of many other things that you can do to make a high quality learning and working environment in your school. So actually CHIPS has a design toward zero net energy set of criteria, so this is something to think about. They actually have criteria related to being ZNE ready or solar ready, ZNE capable, and so I think when you're going through this process, using the CHIPS criteria can be a really beneficial strategy as well. And referenced in CHIPS is the Zero Energy Performance Index, or the ZEPI scale, and this is actually a great tool to be thinking about not just one building but maybe your whole district, and ranking your school's performance. So this scale is basically built upon the CBEX. The 100 is set at the CBEX 2003 data point, and you can chart your course to getting to zero with the ZEPI scale. So this is, again, referenced in CHIPS, and it's something that you can use as a common metric as well. So you can see here the CHIPS California criteria and the points for zero net energy, and this kind of 55 total possible points for zero net energy, and additional CHIPS recognition for the CHIPS verified project. So again, a great standard to be thinking about in a parallel effort when you're doing ZNE. So let's keep moving. Now that you've put in place your plan for getting to zero, that now you can be thinking about integrating it into your policies and delivery process. So we're just going to quickly go through some of the things to consider when you're thinking about how to actually contract to get a ZNE building, and then moving into funding and financing and training and operations. So among the tools that Heather was mentioning and the templates that we have, here's a great example of one of them, integrating ZNE into your delivery method. And this is a step-by-step process from the very beginning of visioning all the way through education and training and certification or marketing and promoting your project. And in this case, this one is completed, right? So this is one of our templates where NBI staff has gone through and provided you with, just some examples of what you can include.
I think of this as a good cheat sheet.
It's a cheat sheet,
stick
yes.
this up on your bulletin board. This is kind of an overview of the major steps that you might want to be thinking about. So we'll be sending a copy of the workbook as well that people can start thinking about. But if you want to come to one of our trainings, we can kind of help you start to develop some of this plan too.
Yeah, and I think it's important not to just take everything that we've written into these templates, but actually to review and then decide what's relevant for you. So it's a good cheat sheet. It's good guidance, and we do hope you use those tools. So again, we recognize that in order to actually, in the end, achieve zero net energy with your project or your campus or district, it is really, really important that you integrate the requirements for achieving zero net energy into your request for qualifications and request for proposals, as well as your contract documents and your ultimate contracts that you're going to have with the construction team. So there's a good reference here, the Net Zero Energy Design. This is a book by Tom Hootman, who's an architect based in Colorado. And in this, he provides some guidelines for RFPs.
And a lot of the lessons, I think, came from his work on the NREL project in
that's
Colorado
right.
too. So there were a lot of great resources that they developed through that process and good guidelines here. So
So, and I think the key thing to say is, if you want to achieve zero net energy, and if you even have a notion about the energy use intensity target that you have, that should be integrated into your RFP, and that you can start to request qualifications from teams that are either design teams, architects, engineers, design build teams. Request the qualifications for them that demonstrate that they've achieved this before on another project.
So there might be a question that's related to this. Someone asked, if a new building project is in pursuit of ZNE only when proven economically feasible, how did the design team deliver that request? What are the key aspects we should look out for in the early phase of design besides integrated process? So that might be something where you could actually put that into the RFP. And
True.
that I think, for example, the Berkeley West Branch Library, the city of Berkeley didn't actually include it in their RFP, but because the design team suggested that they would deliver a ZNE project at no additional cost, they ended up giving the contract to that design firm. And so it's definitely possible. There are trade-offs in that, and in the design sometimes. But
and we'll talk about how we think about costs in just a moment. But I think there is an important point that Heather just made, which is that design teams that are demonstrating their capability to achieve zero net energy with a project are basically elevating their chances of being awarded a project, especially if they could say we will do it in a cost-effective manner or at no additional cost. And again, we've seen examples where these projects have come in, on par with a typical project that would not be ZNE, right? So,
and you could also include that in your RFQ. So we would like to see clients that are providing buildings that are performing at this particular energy efficiency level. And let's say you've already got an RFP out there, you could also then be asking those particular questions when you're interviewing for a design consulting team.
That's right. Similarly, what do you need to think about when you're developing your budget? So here's some guidelines, thinking about approaching it with life cycle cost rather than first cost, or, and then how are you going to be making the selection process, and also thinking about soft costs. So, Pauline mentioned several things that need to be considered during your process of developing your budget and also your RFP. Will there be modeling? Will there be additional modeling? Will you be requiring an ASHRAE Level 2 audit? Will you be doing computational fluid dynamics modeling because you're thinking about natural ventilation and air quality? What about modeling renewable energy systems? So those are all soft costs that need to be considered in your budget as you go.
Or additional team training or things like that that might extend the length of the design team contract, and so planning for that to make an effective operating ZNE building, not just a ZNE design building.
Absolutely, yeah. So let's talk about these different delivery methods. When you get to the point where you're considering how you will contract for the construction of a project, there's many different approaches that you can use. Some in schools especially are restricted on how they can contract for a new building or a renovation. So we want to be cognizant of the fact that you may be limited, but just here are some of the considerations as you go through that process. So a lot of schools typically often do the design bid build, right? So you do the design, you then put it out for bid, and you go through the bidding process, and you select a contractor, the best apparent bid in the process, and then you move forward with construction. This is a traditional process. The way to think about this for a ZNE building, if you are limited to doing design bid build, is that it's pretty important that you can still, in a design bid build, you can include qualifications, right? So you can qualify the bidders and have requirements for them to have either project experience or staff credentials and things like that. That can help to narrow the field a bit. And part and parcel of this also is to do a pre-bid conference and a pre-construction conference, right, where you're educating them about zero net energy and your goals and what you want to achieve and how the process is going to work. So, getting really informed bids will help to keep your bid costs down. And I think what we'll begin to see in the market is that contractors that have experience are going to be providing better qualified bids. And so I think this is going to get sorted out as the market advances. Of course, there is design build. Some schools are able to do this. So this process is where you actually contract with a contractor that is a single entity with the designer as part of that contractor team. And the benefit of this is that you actually can have the design team and the contractor on board early and as part of the design process. And especially with a ZNE building, the notion that you can do cost estimating, that you can do the constructability evaluations, and really try and get a much better design out of the process if it's done well. I'm just going to go back for a second, because in design bid build, even though you don't have the contractor on board, you can hire a contractor to do pre-construction services, and that could be very useful in terms of doing cost estimating and constructability evaluations. And then, CMGC, or guaranteed maximum price, again, another option where you could actually do this cost type contract, open book, where it's a fixed fee for for the contract, and the contractor's responsible for cost overruns. The key thing here is that the contract documents have to be very solid. Otherwise, you're going to have real challenges with change orders, and so this could be problematic. But having a guaranteed maximum price contract might be desirable. Another option is a leaseback, basically working with a developer or a contractor that will build a building and then lease it, and that kind of lease to own scenario could be good. It is one way to get a building that is a much lower first cost. Another method, integrated project delivery. So we're beginning to see this with high-performance buildings and ZNE buildings. This is really a three-party contract where the owner, the design team, and the contractor are really in a three-party agreement. And this is more of a shared risk model. So this is something to think about if it's something that you can do through your contracting process. But again, this being fairly new and not as common, may be challenging to do within your approved contracting methods. And then another one I think that's really interesting, and we've recently learned of some examples of this in California as well, is to think about working with an ESCO, basically a company that will partner with you to do an energy savings performance contract, or ESPC. And in this case, basically that company comes in and partners with you. They will bring the capital, they will make the energy efficiency improvements, and then they'll share in the savings. And so we're beginning to see this model emerge. It's interesting potentially for ZNE school retrofits, because we recognize that there are some high-performing schools that are not that far from achieving ZNE, right? They're highly efficient. They need some modification to HVAC systems, controls, lighting. And so an ESPC could be a good way to basically work with a third party to actually deliver ZNE very cost effectively. So something to consider if this is something that you can do within your current contracting approach. So let's talk about taking it a step further with life cycle costing and funding and financing strategies and guidelines. So I think one thing we know for sure is that schools are unique as a building type and as a market because schools are owner-occupied and that the owner is the long-term owner, and they basically have a long-term interest in high-performance building and lower operating costs. And so rather than thinking about only first costs when you're working on developing your budget and your pricing for a project, think about life cycle cost analysis. And basically the way life cycle cost analysis works is it not only integrates first cost, but it integrates utility costs on an ongoing basis, ongoing maintenance, repair and replacement, and then residual value of equipment. And so what it does is it actually takes all of those factors and it brings them to a net present value. So it's basically thinking not just about first cost, but the long-term value of investments and efficiency. And so this is a really, I think, a key method that we recommend that you integrate into your development process. There are many tools that you can use. We've just showed one example here. The state of Washington it has one that they've developed. It's an Excel spreadsheet, and it's called ELCCA, or the Energy Lifecycle Cost Spreadsheet. And it is a tool you can use basically to do lifecycle costing for your project and demonstrate that value. All state projects in Washington are required to do this, and so this could be a good method for you as well. Again, there are other tools that you can consider using out there. So earlier, Heather and I were talking about the fundraising and financing strategies, and there's a long list of them. Prop 39 is just one on the list, but there's still the Savings by Design program that you can leverage. You could get basically funding for piloting and research. You could be doing technology demonstrations, and that could be through external grant funding. You could do this idea of ZNE ready, right? Like, can we design the future achievement of ZNE in, even if we can't do it right now, right? So that upgradable design strategy. The solar financing district and using, for instance, PACE funding, coming up with prototypes like Campbell School District, where they knew they were going to build 8 schools. They developed a prototype, and that can save a lot on the design cost. Yes, they'll modify that over time, as they develop and learn from those building those prototypes. And I would suggest not just prototyping a school, but maybe even prototyping technologies that you use, like a certain lighting system or control system or HVAC system. In the workshop I was in last week in Massachusetts, the facilities manager was talking about how frustrating it can be when different design teams come in with different technologies in every school that they build. So, within a district, you don't want a whole bunch of different, HVAC systems and control systems and lighting systems. So design standards are pretty key there. And so you could prototype those systems as part of your ZNE plan. And certainly trying to draw a link between your operating budget and your capital budget. Like, we know that those budgets basically are in 2 different buckets or silos, and so is it possible to get the folks that are responsible for capital budgeting and those for operating budgeting together to talk about the implications of getting to zero? And again, we talked about some of these other ones, PPAs, ESCOs, and there's other opportunities out there. So one thing we'd like to share is this study done by NREL talking about cost control strategies for zero energy buildings, and basically saying that there is mounting evidence that we can get there within typical construction budgets, and we are seeing that in ZNE buildings that we're documenting, and we're hearing those stories, and we're trying to document that with case studies as well. So we hope that that is the approach that you can use to be successful in your project. So finally, something that came up in the discussion with Pauline is this idea of post-construction, right? So what happens when you're moving from design and construction into operations and occupancy? So it's important to be thinking not just about the design and the operations, but also the implications of the tenants or occupants in the building, the students, the faculty, the administration. So again, we think it's really pretty important to actually design and plan for that transition into operations and occupancy, doing an owner orientation and operator training, having an M&V plan, right, metering and verification, measurement and verification, or metering and feedback plan. Having purchasing guidelines for equipment. So is there a purchasing agent for your school district? Can you help them to set up standards for the purchasing of plug-load equipment? And then moving into the occupant training, and then having a maintenance plan. In some of the workshops that we've been holding recently, there was a great discussion about integrating the ZNE building into the curriculum and really engaging and activating students in the process. So at the very least, developing a green team that includes students, giving students some ownership of performance, whether it's through dashboards, actually seeing how the building's performing. Do they have a role in making sure that the lighting and plug-load equipment is being used efficiently? And how can you engage them? So I think that's another key piece that we think can be really beneficial. And as I think Pauline suggested, the students really understand this stuff. They ask hard questions, but they're also excited to get there, and then they're going to carry this forward in their lives as future leaders. So, Heather, we move into resources.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things that I've been lucky to be able to be a part of at NBI is to support the California Public Utilities Commission in developing a set of tools and resources. So one of the things that I am very excited about is this Early Adopters Leadership Network, and we've been doing this since 2013. We've developed this kind of set of tools and resources and trainings to be able to really support a peer-to-peer learning network. And so there's a link to this LinkedIn group at the bottom, and I encourage you to join. There's a sort of emerging schools subset, but you know, it's really a place where you could exchange ideas and ask questions, and really, you know, we have built a lot of the workshop materials that have come forward in the Prop 39 trainings from some of this early adopters leadership network. So I hope you'll join, and really, you know, there's a lot to be gleaned from kind of hosting a training in your area or a workshop, and you know, taking people through these planning tools, maybe hosting a ZNE tour, and you know, facilitating that conversation of, you know, what lessons can we learn from other projects or from, you know, efforts that might be coming up. How can we be sort of getting ahead of that too? So some of the tools are these ultra low and ZNE case studies. So this is an example of a retrofit project, the Bacon Street offices. That was an architecture office retrofit of a 1960s building. And again, this is, you know, a set of 8 case study examples that we've developed as sort of briefs, 2-pagers for the California Public Utilities Commission. So there are some very great in-depth case studies out there that might be more than your target audience needs. If you're really interested in the nuts and bolts, there's some great ones that PG&E has developed, and there's some links here, and there's another set that's coming out. These are more like 20-page in-depth case studies. There's also the NBI registry, which is a place where you can share your own case study information, and that's an opportunity to also get information into the Getting to Zero database that I mentioned at the very beginning of our session today. We also have a great resource called the ZNE Action Bulletin, and this is a newsletter, an electronic newsletter that comes out a couple times a year on behalf of the CPUC, and we usually profile a particular, you know, leading project. Most of the time it's California, but oftentimes we draw from national research and other innovative projects, firsts, and it's a great place to stay up on other policy and planning information and other upcoming training and education. So it's also a great opportunity to share information about your own efforts. If you wanted to email us, my information is here if you'd like to sign up or send me some other information about what you're doing. We have the ZNE Communications Toolkit, which is such a great, very rich and deep set of information. So make sure that your communications staff have access to this. If you have a champion at your school, or if you're in the design firm, you might be able to make sure that you're drawing from this information either to build out your website content or for responding to RFPs and RFQs, developing your communications planning. So there are a significant set of resources. I'll just, you know, race through these really quickly, but you can get all of these on our website, and they're free and available to you. So we have these fact sheets for different particular audiences, so some of these might be more appropriate depending upon which particular group you're advocating with. Again, these are one-pagers, double-sided, really nice sets of quick questions and bullet points of talking points so that we can be consistently communicating about the why and the how of ZNE. And then there's also a set of frequently asked questions. There's another set for design, fundamentals, and resources for more information. So I encourage you to get not only just the individual fact sheets, but if you get the whole ZNE companion guide, it also has a little matrix of which documents are appropriate for which audiences. And we also have a set of presentation templates, so you're certainly welcome to use this recording today of our webinar to educate and advocate, maybe host another kind of training for a particular audience that you're interested in communicating with. But you can also take these free slides that are, again, all branded with and consistent with the toolkit, and use those to embed those into your communication presentations. And then this is another set of ideas for ways that you can be integrating these toolkit resources. So training your key staff on what resources are available, making sure those toolkit contents are embedded where you can in presentations, reusing information from our newsletters and other kinds of, maybe you have your own newsletter or you have another kind of communication vehicle you'd like to share it with. If you're going to design team meetings, bringing those or communicating with another client about why and how. And then also as other events, you might be able to share these. So again, a lot of the material is here. Some key takeaways. Really embedding ZNE into your plan, developing that plan, using some of the materials that we have or your own, getting and using the communication tools and planning workbook, building your capacity through education, collaboration, convening. Again, I mentioned those trainings. We have a set coming up in Southern California that we'll go over at the very end that are part of our 12 trainings that we're doing for the 39 pilot. And then really getting started today. So here's another kind of cheat sheet list of, setting those targets. How can you be engaging your leadership to adopt this formal policy or target? Is there an opportunity to be assessing what is coming up in the pipeline? Do you have another significant project that might be a new school project, or maybe you're looking at retrofitting a new roof or an old outdated system? How could you be maybe working towards ZNE? Even if you aren't able to achieve that, you could be working towards an ultra-low energy performance. How can you be amending your existing delivery process, so embedding it into your RFP and RFQ requirements, as Ralph talked about, your specifications? How can you also get to not only ZNE design, but ZNE persistence? So how can you maintain a ZNE? ZNE is not just an end target. It's a process. It's a journey. It's a journey. And so, not just aiming for zero. How can you, be aiming for this long term? Maybe you want to be aiming for net positive. But how can you embed those goals in and achievement of those over the long haul? And then how are you going to engage your stakeholders? Both your leadership, your public-facing staff, but your internal staff that's going to help you get to those operations and behavior that are so important, engaging your students and your champions and embedding that into your classrooms. And then, getting that to scale. Do you want to start with just a pilot project, maybe a single classroom versus a whole building? Doing a larger kind of campus-wide approach, or maybe an entire district or portfolio-wide approach. So, we've been working with some of the state agencies, and we're hearing that, DMV and the California Lottery, they're not going to do any pilots. They're doing all ZNE for new construction. So, really, do you want to be, dipping your toe in the water, or do you want to be highly ambitious and really go for it? So, we encourage all of those approaches to start moving the market further. And, people asked about cost, and what we're hearing from schools like, for example, the Leyva School assistant superintendent really is that the business case for making the building net zero is that it will not just lower their energy bills, but also allow them to put the savings straight back into the top line of their operations and budget for maintaining programs for kids. So that's a really compelling message. This is going to give you, in a time when budgets are really tight, a lot more resources to be supporting your innovative sustainability curriculum, but your education, science, technology, engineering, math programs. So it's a great opportunity to take advantage of this, and exciting and great, building that next generation of leaders. So there's more information here on the Prop 39 pilot program. If you want to know about what the process is to sign up for your applications for next year and learn more about some of our trainings. Here are a couple that are coming up. We'll be in San Diego in May for both a technical training, which is an all-day training, and then we'll take a tour. The next day we'll have a institutional training that's a half-day training, and then we'll be in Newport on June 17th, and in Oakland June 1st, and then in June 30th we'll be on at the Cal State Fullerton campus presenting at the California Higher Education and Sustainability Conference. So we hope that you will join us at some of those. And last but not least, we have the upcoming forum. If you want to mention something about that?
We certainly, if this is something that interests you and you want to go really deep on zero net energy, we invite you to the Getting to Zero National Forum, which is coming up in Denver in October. So we hope to see you there. And now we have some time for a couple of questions. Connie, have some good questions come up that you would like to share?
We have one right now, just to help clarify. Who were the target audiences for the education provided under Prop 39 pilot project?
Well, as I mentioned on that the flyer slide about the upcoming trainings, we've really targeted two different groups. So these trainings are intended to advance real deep technical knowledge for the building industry. So we're talking about, thanks Ralph, the architects, the engineers, the you can see on the right-hand side of our slides, operations managers, you know, operations staff, building designers. So that's one side of the table, but then also on the institutional side, we really wanted to get and reach the community of schools, the administrators, the teachers, the school boards, others, other stakeholders, business officers, and you know, really making sure that we're providing kind of the necessary level of information to those different groups to help move both sides of the table, you know, along in the market. So I hope that answers your question.
Any other questions?
Well, one came up earlier, and I think this is just a good way to wrap this. How do we adapt the California experience to use in other climate zones?
Yeah, so you know, it's interesting because again, doing these trainings and workshops in California, but we are also presenting and doing workshops nationally. And I think, you know, the question does come up, you know, how important is EUI in different climate zones? And what we're finding is that even in more extreme climate zones where there's, you know, high demand for heating and cooling, that these EUI targets, you know, the range of 20 to 25 are still really valid. And that you just need to tailor your design strategies to that particular climate zone. So in a hot and cold climate, perhaps more of a focus on the envelope would be key. And then what are the HVAC systems that really make sense in that climate zone? You know, in the Southwest, evaporative cooling, you know, direct, indirect evaporative cooling could be really valid. You know, in you know, New England, you know, looking at cold climate heat pumps and technologies like that. So I think there's definitely a way to take our lessons from California and expand them nationally, and we are in that process. And we're going to be working also in partnership with CHIPS to bring more technical, you know, assistance to the CHIPS criteria as well.
We are close to noon. Do we,
yeah.
Are there any more questions, or should we?
We haven't gotten any more for this second half.
Great.
All
well,
right.
We are right on time.
Yeah. So thank you, Connie, and thank you all for just participating in this event. We hope to see you at some of the live workshops coming up in California, and we would welcome any questions you have after this webinar.
And as Connie mentioned, we will be sending out a survey, so we'd love your feedback. You know, this really influences how, what kind of information we present at these trainings and what you found useful, what you think maybe might be improved, or other information that you'd like to hear about.
Yeah.
And feel free to email us with any questions, if we can support you in your efforts. And if you'd like to be added to our ZNE Action Bulletin, or to get a copy of the ZNE watch list. So,
thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Good luck.